Okay, thank you again. Here we are in our sixth lecture. Here we are, six roads down the road. And this is entitled Israel's Disobedience. Israel's Disobedience. You know, you read the Old Testament, and it seems like practically every chapter is about Israel's disobedience in some form or another. But this particular story that we want to talk about, that's centered around Genesis chapter 34, I say has particular significance in relation to God's overall plan and purpose for Israel. Okay? Again, this disobedient act that encompasses this entire chapter of Genesis 34, I say has particular significance in God's overall plan for purpose for Israel. And the important thing is to see how God overruled and then led Israel on the right path. Now, when Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, remember when he fought with him that night and he wouldn't let him go, and the angel or the Lord touched him in the thigh and he became crippled. And anyway, God changed him from Jacob to Israel. When he returned to Canaan after his 14-year sojourn in the east with his uncle Laban, okay? And what did he get? He got his 2 wives there, didn't he? In those 14 years. And God blessed him. My, how God blessed him. But he became a wealthy man, didn't he? But God was going to use him in spite of himself. And anyway, he settled down after he came back. Got away from his brother, remember. His brother let him go. He didn't go out to kill him or anything. But soon after the family arrived, this sordid story involving the only daughter in the family, the daughter Dinah, went out to visit, I say, some of the Shechemite ladies in her age group probably. And the Bible does not give all the details. It's gory enough, isn't it? But it's quite evident that she went on this venture without, I say, a proper escort. And that could be said even today, couldn't it? Pretty much so. But in the course of events, she was discovered by the prince. Evidently, he was the crown prince of the country, who, deciding he wanted her for his wife, she was obviously a very beautiful woman, and he took her and violated her virginity, I say. Now, the biblical account does not indicate whether she participated willingly in this affair, or if she was forcibly raped. It doesn't say. At any rate, the brothers of this young woman, and she had many brothers, didn't she? And they were, as they dealt with the younger brother Joseph, were certainly not a group that you would want to encounter on a dark night if they didn't like you. And so they set out to restore their sister's honor in the only way they knew how, they thought. Which was to mete out retribution on the people of Shechem. Excuse me. Now at this point, the question needs to be asked. Why did God allow this sordid incident to appear in the Bible? I go on to say that the New Testament does relate that these types of incidents and problems that Israel encountered along the way are for our examples, that we may learn, take heed, and not fall in the same trap. And of course that instruction Paul gives us in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. So this is certainly true, however, in this incident. There seems to be a much deeper meaning, however, I say, and purpose relating to the development of Israel as a nation. As a nation. Now, in continuing the story of Dinah's defilement, the king of Shechem, he tried to solve the problem by making a deal with Jacob. Okay? How about all these deals going on with Israel and the surrounding nations down there? And it seems like they get a deal and before they can turn around it falls apart, doesn't it? Well, this deal of the king of Shechem was, he said, look, why don't you folks just settle down here and we'll give you a piece of land, or plenty of territory for your, I don't know how big the family of Jacob was, but at the most it was 40 or 50 people, okay, at this time. But he says there in 9th and 10th verses, you can dwell with us, and the land shall be before you, and you can trade, and you can acquire possessions, and we just become one people, okay? And we can intermarry, and let the prince have your daughter, etc., and let's do it this way. Well, this seemed like a very workable plan, but after all, they were back in the land of Canaan, the land of promise. They're here. But at this point in time, I say Israel, Jacob's family, was quite small. Okay? Maybe, as I said a moment ago, 40 or 50. But I say this, if Jacob had followed the advice of the king of Shechem, if he had gone into this plan, Israel would have completely lost their ethnicity. Okay? How many generations would it have taken? 3 at the most. 3 at the most. 4, 5. They'd been gone. Okay? In a very short time, Israel would have ceased being a separate people. They would never have become the nation God intended for them to become. And the promise that God made to Abraham would have ended. And we need to emphasize that. The great plan of God to make Israel a priest nation, enabling them to reach out to all the nations with the message of His mercy and grace, would have been completely stopped, thwarted. This plan of the king of Shechem, seemingly accepted by Israel, never had a chance, I say, to get off the ground because of what? Of the deceitful action of Dinah's brothers. They thought maybe, well, it's a good plan, but did they really think so? So they suggested the only way for this intermarriage plan could be accepted was for all the males in Shechem to be circumcised. So this was accepted by the Shechemites, but while they were all hurting from the surgeries, the sons of Jacob fell upon them with their swords, and they knew how to use swords, and cut them to pieces. Okay? By this treachery, the intermarriage problem was eliminated, but what now happened? Another larger problem loomed up. Their identity as a nation would also be lost in this way. What would happen? Well, the surrounding nations hear about it, would fall upon them. They couldn't defend themselves. This little family of 40, 50 people among all those surrounding nations, they could have wiped them off the face of the earth. So what happened? It points out in Genesis chapter 34, verses 30 particularly, it goes on to say that word about this would spread throughout the surrounding area to the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And Jacob said to his sons, what? So Jacob finally now takes the authority. You know. Now, what these sons did, was it done behind his back? Probably. All right? But anyway, the plan was put into effect, and then the sons did this deceitful thing, didn't they? But anyway, Jacob finally gets his sons by the nape of the neck somehow, And he says all these people will be stirred up, a war will ensue, and we will be destroyed. Verse 30. And then I say, because the eternal Abrahamic covenant was at stake, in jeopardy, God intervened and instructed Jacob. What did he say? Those verses that go into Genesis chapter 35, 1 and 2. He said, go back to Bethel, dwell there, put away all the foreign gods that are among you. See what had already begun to happen? Idolatry had already set in. Because these people, this family, under these sons, evidently Joseph even had not even been born at this point. If he had been, he was a very young lad. Very young, maybe 2 or 3 years old. Okay? But they had already gone back into the foreign gods, even without intermarriage. So it reinforces what we were saying last hour, that idolatry already is implanted once we just go through motions of loving God and worship Him. And not even loving Him, just going through the motions of religion. If that's all that it is, the Bible already says it's already idolatry. Okay? But they had foreign gods among them. So I say it is quite evident that God took this action to preserve them as a nation. To protect them as they fled from Shechem, God sent His terror among all the cities. Notice Genesis 35. Verses 1 to 5. Let me read those verses. Then God said to Jacob, arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there, and make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau your brother. Okay? Go back to the place of renewal. Sometimes we need to do that, don't we? Just go back to the place where we met God. Now, is the place have any authority? Does the place have any spiritual reality to it? The place itself? No, but somehow, if we get there and we begin to think, meditate, and let the Spirit of God take hold of us again, we can begin to see through what God wants us to do. Okay? So he said, go back to Bethel. Okay? And then, as I already said, and Jacob said to his household, put away the foreign gods that are among you, purify yourselves, and change your garments. And then let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and has been with me in the way which I have gone. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods. They had a bunch of them, which were in their hands, and all their earrings were in their ears. Wonder what that was all about. Talking about the men. That must have had some religious significance to it, didn't it? I don't know. But it's interesting, and it just sort of hits you. The earrings which were in their ears, does that mean that we're not supposed to wear earrings? No. I don't know, and I see a man with earrings. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Wasn't there a time when the servants had to wear earrings?
Yes, I think you're right. Mm-hmm. The servants had to wear earrings. It was a branded.
There was to be a servant for life.
Yeah, yeah. So it had to do with.
This may be different.
Well, there.
Between the master and the servant.
Yeah, it had some connection from the standpoint of what your intent, what should I say, who you had sworn allegiance to. Okay? And Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree which was by Shechem. And they journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were all around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. So who intervened here? God did. But they had to make the move to go, didn't they? And then God helped them. Okay? So I say in that second paragraph, first column, page 26, in spite of the fact that the sons of Jacob were very divisive, self-seeking in their action against the men of Shechem, God allowed their action to protect and preserve Israel as a nation. God did not condone it. He just allowed it. Again, we can say that God uses even, as I've said many times, the wrath of man to praise him. Psalm 76:10. So in sending Jacob back to Bethel, or Bethel, how do you like to pronounce? I think that's more correct, Bethel, isn't it? Something like that. Back to his place of commitment to God. God set the next stage in the journey to make them into what? The instrument of evangelism that he wanted them to become. The next journey, the next step, okay? It seems like that's true of us, isn't it? God has to take a step at a time to get us going. Sometimes we balk and get off on the track, and he has to get us back on the track again, but it's the next step. And so the next title is Israel's 400-year sojourn in Egypt. Mention has already been made in chapter 5, I say, concerning Israel's 400 years. We just talked about it at the last hour. The prophecy in Genesis 15. Over 100 years later, God spoke to Jacob about this matter in this revelation to Jacob. God gave Jacob some more details, revealing the country of the sojourn and his purpose. And you go over to chapter 46 of Genesis, okay? And here's some wonderful detail here of what God said to Jacob about the next journey. It says, so Israel took his journey. Israel now is Jacob, isn't it? See? With all that he had, and came to Beersheba, and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Then God spoke to Israel, to Jacob in the visions of the night, and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. And he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation. That's what he told. I wonder if Jacob knew that. I reckon Abraham had passed this story along to Isaac, and Isaac along to Jacob, about what God had said. You're going to be in another country for 400 years, and out of it you will become a nation. I wonder. You think God left that out of the story? What do you think? I don't think so. I think here Jacob had to be reminded of it. Okay? He had to be reminded of it. But I think he recalled it then. Okay? And he said, I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again. And Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. Then Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob, their little ones and their wives, in the carts which Pharaoh had sent to carry them. And of course, before this, you have the story of Joseph, don't you? How he was sold out by his brothers down into Egypt, but how God used him in such a miraculous way. And now, the time for the family to go, which is stated here in chapter 46. Okay? The stage is set. And the 400 years begins. Okay? So on the second column, page 26 of the second paragraph, in further consideration of his great mission purpose, God's great mission purpose, that is, after the long sojourn was completed, God used all the mighty miracles surrounding the Exodus to reveal and establish throughout the world, and we talked about this the last hour, that He is what? The living, eternal Creator God. That's what you have to say and show when you declare the name of the Lord, isn't it? He's the Creator, He's the living God, the high God, the only God. He's eternal, and He's the Creator God. Even after the Exodus was completed, and the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness had passed, the people of Canaan still remembered the mighty deeds performed by God in Egypt. And where does this come about? Well, you go over to Joshua chapter 2, verses 9 and 11. And here is the story, the failure of the Gibeonites, okay? And under Joshua. After they had been discovered and they had deceived Israel, remember? And the Gibeonites said to Joshua in verse 9 of Joshua chapter 9, so they said to him, from a very far country your servants have come, because of the what? The name of the Lord your God. Have you got that? Joshua 9:9. Joshua 9:9. See, they're already in Israel. But here the story is coming out. So these Gibeonites said to him, from a very far country your servants have come, because they're deceiving Israel now, because the name of the Lord your God, for we have heard of His fame and all that He did where? In Egypt. See that? How many years have gone by now since this occurred in Joshua, under Joshua? 40? At least 40 years. Okay? Now then, it's so easy, for Israel to forget after 6 months, isn't it? Sometimes we as Christians too, same way. It's so easy to forget. But these people were so terrified of what God did in Egypt and all those stories that came out, that they were terrified of these people, Israel. And so they deceived them in that way. But that's why, it's because the fear of God was still upon them. Now, we talk about the fear of God, don't we? But it's important anyway. And Rahab said the same thing, didn't she? Remember when the spies came in at Jericho? She said the same thing. We know who you are. The story of what you did in Egypt is still reverberating in this country. Okay? God put that fear there. And so there were people who turned to the Lord. Readily turned to Him, like Rahab. So the last paragraph on that second column, just before Israel profanes God's name, I say, through the mighty miracles of God in the Exodus and through the 40 years of wilderness wandering, God's name was emphatically exalted throughout the whole world, only by the hand of God. The priest nation Israel, even before she reached the promised land, was started off with a mighty step forward in her ministry of telling forth God's name. But what happened? Israel profanes God's name. The next group here. The next title. And I go on to say, Israel had hardly gotten started in the pursuit of possessing Canaan for God's glory before rebellion and disobedience began to take its toll. Here we are. Round and round and round. You say, well, it's easy to say though, isn't it? Well, with all the mighty miracles and all of how God provided and led, and just right out there in the forefront with them, how could they not see God's mighty hand wherever they turned? You say, it's easy for us to say, oh, boy, if it had been me, I would have never forsaken the Lord. We've got to be careful about that. But instead of driving out the totally depraved, ungodly nations as God had instructed, they settled down among them, intermarried with them, and soon were doing what? Worshiping other gods, and were only doing what? Going through the motions of worshiping the living God, who had brought them out of Egyptian bondage. Now then, the question is asked, if Israel was supposed to be the priest nation and a witness to the other nations, why were they given the orders by God to destroy those nations in Canaan? What do you think about that? Have you ever mulled that over and worried with it? I say this may seem like an impossible question to answer, but we must remember that it was God who gave those specific orders, and it is God alone who knows the hearts of mankind. Isn't that true? Now, Professor Verkuyl deals with this question by using the term God's antagonistic motive. Title. Antagonist. Is God an antagonist? Is God a big bully? This, he says, is Yahweh's powerful wrestlings against those powers and forces which oppose his liberating and gracious authority. Unquote. I say Verkuyl goes on to explain how the whole Old Testament is filled with the descriptions of how Yahweh Adonai, the covenant God of Israel, is warring against those forces which try to overthrow, thwart, and subvert his plans for his creation. And he closes by saying, quote, the Old Testament ties the antagonistic motif closely with the doxological theme, the glory of Yahweh or Adonai shall be revealed among all peoples. Then every human being shall come to know him as he really is, the gracious and merciful God, slow to get angry, full of kindness, and always willing to turn back from meting out disaster. That's what happened in Jonah, didn't it? And I give that reference there, Jonah 4:12. I say also, we must also remember how God prepared Israel, and what he told them before they entered the land of Canaan. What did he say? Now, this is in Deuteronomy 9:5. And I quote it. It is not, God said to Israel, it's not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart that you go in to possess the land, but because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord your God drives him out before you. Okay? Deuteronomy 9:5. And I go on to say, it is God's prerogative alone. God's prerogative alone. It's not for us to decide. The eternal destiny of a people. He alone knows the heart. He alone knows when, quote unquote, the cup of iniquity is full. And when final judgment must fall, it was on the basis of his all-wise decision that Israel was commanded by God to utterly destroy them. And with that in mind, I'd like to remind you of Abraham's great intercessory prayer for Sodom and Gomorrah. In Genesis chapter 18, beginning with verse 16. Now this is proof, I said when we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. It's proof that Abraham understood the covenant, the commission that God gave him, that in you all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. It's proof that that happened. Because what happened there in that prayer, that first intercessory prayer in the Bible for another people? Abraham said what? God, listen, I must ask you, if there are 50 people there who still worship you. Now, I wonder what the population of Sodom and Gomorrah, I don't know. But I can imagine it Pretty good size. Could we say 500? Can we say several thousand? We could. Yeah, okay. 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 There was a big group of people. But God said, listen, if there are 50 people there, I won't destroy any of them. Did Abraham stop? No. He persisted before the Lord. This is intercessory prayer, isn't it? See, if there are 40 people, God said, if there are 40 people there, I won't destroy them. But Abraham didn't stop. But Lord, if there's 45, just 45, no, I won't destroy them, God said. 40, 30, 20. And Abraham continues in intercessory prayer from his heart because he's concerned for these people. Okay? God says if there are 10 there, I won't do it. But there weren't. So God knew the situation in the land of Israel at this time. You know? And they're always, we're not told about those who come and follow them. We know about Rahab, don't we? God gives us little inklings along the way of people who turned to Him and followed Him. And the Gibeonites, God took them in, didn't He? Even though they were deceitful. They became slaves, but God took them in. They were nurtured. So I go on to say, in God's scheme of things, the heart relationship of man is the most important thing. The heart relationship. Just to go through the motions of religious exercise, here we are again, while at the same time embracing the religious practices of false religion, even though it might be expedient and neighborly, is syncretistic religious intermingling. Syncretistic religious intermingling. What do we have going on in America today since September the 11th, 2 years ago? You can talk about the God of Islam, but don't talk about Jesus. Is that right? And there are those among the Islamics and among Westerners who are saying, oh, there are godly people. Well, there are many of them, and probably the majority of them are God-fearing people in a sense that we use it. They're not militaristic. But just to say that the seeds of the problem is not there in their Quran, it is there, folks. I challenge you to study it. If you don't think it's not there, it's there. Okay? And they do not worship the true and living God. It's not there, folks. Okay? Even though, any more than it is in Mormonism. Okay? And it's easy to get caught up in syncretistic religious intermingling with other religions. And it's happening in America. It's happening all around us. Okay? God hated it then and He hates it now. Israel did not drive out the totally depraved, ungodly nations. They fully mixed with them in all of their practices. They intermarried with them and thus became an idolatrous people. And simply, they profaned the name of the living God. Israel was called by God to be a sanctified, set-apart people. And I use the word black and white. Now, notice how I'm using it here. And tell me if I'm doing it right. Black was to be black and white was to be white. Now, I'm not saying what black was or white, but I'm just saying there was a clear distinction between the problem. But what do we try to do? To profane means unsanctified, not set apart, not black and white, but blended gray. See, all religions are good. Okay? And all roads lead to Rome. They say in Japan, all roads lead to the top of Mount Fuji. Okay? You know, the Buddhists are good. Sure, there are a lot of good Buddhists. I know a lot of good Buddhists, don't you? I do. And I'm not saying they don't live good lives. But to know the Lord and to know the truth is a simple, it's a entirely different situation, isn't it? That's how we can be so easily deceived, how it becomes such a gray area that we don't understand. Everything is all fine, okay? Oh yes, they tried to worship God, but in pursuing the gods of the surrounding nations, their so-called worship of God just became a religious exercise. That's all it was. Their hearts were far from Him, from the Lord. In doing this, Israel relegated, listen, I say this, Israel relegated God to the position of a quote-unquote tribal God. Only one God among many gods, which is henotheism. Have you run across that word, henotheism? We talk about atheism and monotheism. This is henotheism, okay? He's a high God, but there are a lot of other gods, and you know. So this intermingling, I say, with the other nations took on a political nature. Here's a political nature, all right? Israel soon abandoned her special relationship with the living God as their only king. A theocracy in favor of a monarchy like the other nations. And there we have the call to Samuel, recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4 to 9. This desire and action was political expediency of the worst kind, I say, meaning self-interest, a means to an end. As their monarchy was established under King Saul, wasn't it? All right? Various treaties were signed with the surrounding nations, and these treaties were sealed by marriages. You see this intermarriage thing? It was a seal that a treaty cannot be broken. It was that thing happened all at the beginning of World War I. You studied World War I? In Europe, how all the kings in Great Britain and England and Europe were all united by marriage, and now they're fighting each other. Okay, same idea here. This practice further precipitated the slippery slide downward into, I say, idolatrous relationships. The two went together, didn't they? So God was now thought of as a mere tribal God, as I said before. Instead of being the God of the nations and allowing them to have a human king, God still desired to lead them and direct them through their king. And there were some very good kings, weren't they? Some godly ones. You could mention David, of course. He was a man after God's own heart. We talked about him last hour in Psalm 51, where after his terrible sin and disgrace, how he repented before the God and poured out his heart and revealed that it's the heart relationship, not the sacrifices. What you want, Lord, is my heart, my obedience, out of love for you. So David was the very epitome of a tremendous leader. How about Solomon? Well, Solomon started out great, wasn't he? He was given great wisdom, and he brought, let me emphasize again, he brought the nation of Israel into the land. He built the temple, didn't he? And remember, we went over his great prayer. Okay? Remember that? In 1 Kings chapter 8. That great prayer where he pours out his heart to God. That this is the place where the people of the world can come and can worship you and can see your great name is there. And in that whole chapter 8 of 1 Kings, he pours out his heart about the peoples of the world. And God gave him wisdom, didn't he? So it was working. This was the purpose Israel was put in the nation. The temple was there. It was open to all peoples, and all peoples came. And it was working like God intended it to work. Israel, the priest nation. And then what happened? Well, all the treaties had to be signed. And all the daughters had to be given in marriage. And the slippery slide started downward, didn't it? And so the kingdom of Israel was divided. 2 tribes remained in Jerusalem. 10 tribes went to Samaria. And those 10 tribes went in, first of all, into captivity and spread all over the world. 722, I believe. And then, of course, the last 2 tribes under Babylon, when Jerusalem was overthrown in 586 BC. Okay? And it stopped. God told Solomon, I say, I will not tear away the whole kingdom, but I will give 1 tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David. And he did. And for the sake of Jerusalem I have chosen. That's 1 Kings 11:13. So, in closing out this session, I say the whole issue of Israel's infidelity and how God had to judge her was what? The name of the Lord. Okay? The name of the Lord. He said, and I quote Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 9, "But I acted for my name's sake," God said, "that it would not be profaned before the Gentiles, among whom they were, in whose sight I had made myself known to them, to bring them out of the land of Egypt." It's in Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 9. God's holy reputation was at stake. His name could not be profaned. Also, the proclamation of his name was the message that must be born. And here's, as we close tonight, here's the thing I want to leave you with. That must be born to all the nations, that who is God? That he is loving, merciful, and long-suffering to all who come to him in heartfelt repentance and true worship. That's what God intended of Israel. And that's what he intends of us. There's the essence of the gospel message. Has it ever changed? Are you satisfied that it's never changed? That it was the same message to Israel as it is to us today? And that's how God is dealing with us. And so with that, we'll close tonight. And then next session, we're going to talk about God's mercy in sending blindness. Blindness. Thank you and good night.